Landon sat at the piano, his fingers resting lightly on the keys. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, waiting, expecting. Some were ready to laugh, others were just curious. But no one, not one person, thought he was about to play something incredible. Landon Hayes sat near the window in his 7th grade classroom at Brookside Academy, watching the trees sway outside. The warm sunlight made little dancing patterns on his desk, but he wasn't paying attention to that. His pencil tapped against his notebook as he worked through the history assignment in front of him. He liked getting his work done early. It meant he could spend the rest of the lesson thinking about things that actually interested him, like music. Landon loved playing the piano. His grandfather had taught him since he was little, showing him how to let his fingers glide across the keys like raindrops on a roof. But at school, hardly anyone knew he could play. Most of the time, people didn't really notice him at all. That included his teacher, Mrs. Davenport. She had been teaching for a long time, and most kids thought she was strict. She wasn't mean, exactly, but she had a way of making certain students feel small, especially Landon. Whenever he raised his hand, she called on someone else. If he got an answer right, she just moved on without a word. But if he made a mistake, she would pause, looking at him like he should have done better. Landon wasn't the only one who noticed. His best friend, Xavier, nudged him as the lesson began. "She never calls on you," Xavier whispered. "It's like you don't exist." Landon shrugged. He had gotten used to it. But today, something felt different. Mrs. Davenport stood at the front of the class, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She was flipping through her lesson book, but every so often, she glanced at Landon. Then, out of nowhere, she did something she had never done before. "Landon," she said, her voice sharp and clear, "why don't you answer this one?" Landon froze. Xavier's mouth dropped open. A few other students turned in their seats to stare. Landon took a deep breath. He wasn't sure why, but something told him that this was the beginning of something big. Landon swallowed hard, his mind racing. Mrs. Davenport had never called on him before. Why now? He glanced at the board where the history question was written. He knew the answer, he had read about it last night. He started, his voice a little shaky. The Union Army's march to the sea was led by General William T. Sherman. It was meant to destroy the South's supplies and weaken their morale during the Civil War. A few students exchanged looks. The answer was right, but Mrs. Davenport didn't react the way she normally did when someone answered correctly. Instead of moving on, she lingered, tilting her head like she was studying him. "Not bad," she said, but there was something in her tone, something almost amused. Landon shifted in his seat, suddenly feeling uncomfortable. Mrs. Davenport wasn't just testing his knowledge. She was watching him, like she was planning something. The lesson continued, but Landon couldn't focus. He felt Mrs. Davenport's gaze land on him more than once. Even Xavier noticed. "Dude, what is up with her today?" he muttered. Landon just shook his head. He had no idea. Then, right before the bell rang, Mrs. Davenport did something unexpected. "Landon," she said as students started packing up. "Stay behind for a moment." A few kids turned to look at him. Landon felt his stomach drop. Staying after class was never a good sign. He took his time putting away his notebook before slowly walking up to her desk. She sat with her hands folded, watching him with that same unreadable expression. "I overheard you talking the other day," she said. "About your grandfather." Landon frowned. "What about him? You said he was a musician." He hesitated, unsure of where this was going. "Yeah," he said. "He was a pianist. He played jazz." Mrs. Davenport's lips curled slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close. "Interesting," she said, tapping a finger against her desk. "So, you must have picked up a thing or two." Landon didn't answer right away. He didn't like the way she was looking at him. A little, he admitted. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes gleamed with something that made him uneasy. "Good to know," she said. Then she leaned back in her chair. "Tomorrow, let's see what you've got." Landon blinked. "What?" Mrs. Davenport nodded toward the old upright piano sitting in the corner of the classroom. It had been there forever, collecting dust. No one ever used it. "You'll play something for the class," she said. A few students near the door overheard. They turned back, wide-eyed. Landon stared at her. "Why?" She tilted her head slightly. "Why not? You said your grandfather played. I'm sure you have some of that talent in you." Landon knew that tone. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't encouragement. It was a challenge. A test. And he had a strong feeling that she wasn't expecting him to pass. Landon barely slept that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning in circles. He knew exactly what Mrs. Davenport was trying to do. She wanted him to mess up, to embarrass himself in front of the whole class. She thought she had set a trap, but she didn't know the truth. Landon could play. And not just a little. His grandfather, James Holloway, had taught him since he was 5 years old. He grew up listening to the deep, rich sounds of jazz in their small home, the old piano filling every corner of the house with music. His grandfather had always told him, "Music isn't just about playing the notes, Landon. It's about telling a story." And tomorrow, Landon was going to tell a story that no one, especially Mrs. Davenport, would forget. By morning, he had a plan. When he arrived at school, the whispers had already started. "Are you really gonna play? Did she make you do it? I didn't even know you played piano." Landon ignored most of the questions, slipping into his seat next to Xavier. "You ready for this?" Xavier asked, raising an eyebrow. Landon smirked. "Oh yeah." Mrs. Davenport walked in a few minutes later, her usual air of control wrapped tightly around her. She placed her books on the desk and glanced at him, just for a second. He could see it, the certainty in her eyes. She was sure he was going to fail. The first half of the class dragged on, but Landon barely heard any of it. His mind was focused on what was coming. Then, just as he expected, Mrs. Davenport closed her lesson book a few minutes early and turned toward the piano in the corner. "Well," she said smoothly, "it looks like we have some extra time today." "Perfect." She clasped her hands together and smiled in that way that wasn't really a smile. "Landon, let's see what you can do." The room shifted. Students turned in their seats. Some whispered, some just watched. Landon could hear a few quiet snickers. They were waiting for him to mess up. He didn't move right away. He let the moment stretch, let the weight of their expectations settle over him. Then he stood. A few muffled laughs rippled through the class as he walked toward the piano. Someone muttered something, but he didn't need to hear it. He already knew the tone. Mrs. Davenport gestured toward the piano. "Play whatever you'd like." Landon studied the instrument. It was old, the keys slightly yellowed with age. Some of them were chipped at the edges. He ran his fingers over them lightly. The piano was out of tune, not by much, but enough. He inhaled. Sat down. Rested his hands on the keys. Then he heard it, someone stifling a laugh behind him. A snicker, low but clear. This wasn't just about proving Mrs. Davenport wrong anymore. It was about proving everyone wrong. And he was about to do it in a way they'd never forget. The classroom had never been this quiet. Landon sat at the piano, his fingers resting lightly on the keys. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, waiting, expecting. Some were ready to laugh, others were just curious. But no one, not one person, thought he was about to play something incredible. Mrs. Davenport stood near her desk, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had set this up as a test. She thought she already knew the outcome. Landon took a deep breath. Then, he played the first note. A single, rich sound filled the air, hanging there for just a second before he continued. His fingers moved carefully, deliberately. He started with something simple, a blues progression, soft and steady, like the music his grandfather used to play on warm summer afternoons. The classroom shifted. The whispers stopped. The smirks faded. The kids who had been waiting for him to fail leaned forward just a little. Landon's hands moved with confidence, rolling over the chords with ease. His left hand kept a steady rhythm while his right hand danced across the melody. He could feel it, the way the music wrapped around the room, changing the air, changing the energy. This wasn't just notes on a piano. This was something more. Mrs. Davenport's face was unreadable, but he caught the tiniest flicker in her expression, a shift in her certainty. She had expected hesitation, maybe a few clumsy notes before he gave up. Instead, she was hearing something she hadn't prepared for. Landon didn't stop to see their reactions. He wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing for himself. For his grandfather. He let himself sink into the music, each note telling a story only he truly understood. His fingers glided effortlessly, striking a balance between precision and raw emotion. Then, he took a risk. He shifted into something more complex, something bold. His hands wove intricate runs up and down the keyboard, blending rich harmonies with deep, rolling bass lines. This was one of the hardest pieces his grandfather had taught him, the one that had taken months to master. And now, he was playing it as if it had always lived inside him. The longer he played, the heavier the silence became. No one laughed now. Xavier sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. Mia, the girl who had giggled earlier, wasn't giggling anymore. Braden, who had made a joke before class, had his arms crossed but wasn't smirking. A few students exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and something else, something closer to admiration. And then, the crescendo. Landon's fingers pressed firmly against the keys, the music swelling, filling every inch of the room. Every quiet space where doubt had once lived was now overtaken by sound, by confidence, by something undeniable. He pushed harder, letting the final run carry the weight of everything he hadn't said. Then, silence. The last note hung in the air for a moment before fading. Landon lifted his hands, resting them on his lap. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then. A single clap. It came from the back of the room. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire class was applauding. Xavier let out a low whistle. Dude. Braden gave a small shake of his head. I didn't know you could do that. Landon exhaled. His heart wasn't pounding from nerves, it was pounding from the energy of what had just happened. He had done more than play. He had changed something. But the loudest silence of all came from Mrs. Davenport. She hadn't moved. Hadn't said a word. The applause continued around her, but she stood still, watching him. For the first time, Landon saw something in her eyes that he never expected. Uncertainty. The classroom was still buzzing from Landon's performance. Students whispered to each other, sneaking glances at him like they were seeing him for the first time. Even Xavier, who always had a joke ready, was uncharacteristically quiet. But the only reaction Landon truly cared about was Mrs. Davenport's. She stood by her desk, arms still crossed, her expression unreadable. When the applause died down, she finally spoke. That was unexpected, she said, her voice measured. You have talent, Landon. But talent isn't enough. Skill must be tested, proven. Landon swallowed hard. He knew what was coming. Mrs. Davenport tapped her fingers against the piano's polished surface. Since you clearly have a grasp of music, let's see how well you handle pressure. A few students leaned in. Even Mia, who had giggled at him earlier, looked intrigued. Mrs. Davenport walked to the chalkboard and wrote a single word: competition. "You and Braden will compete in next week's spring recital," she announced. "Each of you will perform a solo piece. The best performance will represent the school at the city showcase." Landon's stomach flipped. Braden was one of the best pianists in the school. He had been playing classical music for years. Landon had just wanted to prove he wasn't a joke, but now, he was in a competition. He glanced at Braden, expecting a glare, but instead, he saw something else. A smirk. Braden wasn't mad. He was excited. For him, this wasn't a punishment. It was a challenge. Landon sat on his bed that evening, staring at the sheet music in front of him. Competing against Braden. That was like racing a pro athlete after just learning to run. He traced his fingers over the notes on the page, his mind replaying Mrs. Davenport's challenge. He hadn't asked for this. He just wanted to prove he could play. Now, he had to prove he could win. "Landon, dinner's ready," his mom called from the kitchen. He sighed, pushing the music aside and heading downstairs. His little sister, Ava, was already at the table, happily munching on a cornbread muffin. His dad sat across from her, flipping through the newspaper. "You're quiet tonight," his mom said, setting down a plate of baked chicken and green beans in front of him. "Something on your mind?" Landon hesitated. "Mrs. Davenport signed me up for a piano competition." His dad raised an eyebrow. "You sound like that's a bad thing." "I have to go up against Braden. He's been playing forever." His mom sat down, giving him a thoughtful look. "And you've been playing since you were little, too." "Yeah, but he plays proper music. Like Beethoven and Mozart." His dad chuckled. "And you play music that makes people feel something." Landon looked up. "Son, you don't have to sound like Braden. You have to sound like you." Ava grinned. "I think you should play Grandpa's song. The one he always played on the porch." Landon blinked. The blues melody his grandfather used to play. It wasn't fancy, but it was powerful. His fingers twitched. Maybe he didn't have to outplay Braden at his own game. Maybe he just had to play from the heart. The next day, Landon arrived at school feeling the weight of the challenge ahead. He had barely slept, running through different songs in his head. He knew he couldn't match Braden's classical technique, but his grandfather's blues song had a soul to it, something that could reach people in a different way. As soon as the lunch bell rang, he grabbed his tray and made his way to the music room. To his surprise, Tyler was already there, leaning against the piano with his arms crossed. "Figured you'd show up," Tyler said with a grin. "Gotta get ready for the big showdown, huh?" Landon sighed, setting his tray down on a nearby chair. "I don't even know if I can win, man. Braden's been playing since he was a toddler. He plays in competitions." Tyler rolled his eyes. "Yeah, and? You played in our classroom and shut everyone up. That counts for something." Landon hesitated, then sat down at the piano. He placed his fingers on the keys and played the first few notes of his grandfather's song. It started slow, a soft rolling melody that reminded him of summer evenings on the front porch. As he played, he closed his eyes, letting the music guide him. Tyler whistled. "Okay, now I see why you're not sweating it." That was good. Landon smirked, but deep down, he wasn't sure if it would be enough. He needed something more. Just then, the door opened, and Mrs. Davenport walked in. She set her books down and crossed her arms. "Practicing, I see," she said. Landon nodded. "Good. Because if you want to stand a chance against Braden, you'll need more than talent. You'll need control, confidence, and," she tapped the piano, "a little bit of strategy." Landon sat up straighter. "Strategy?" Mrs. Davenport nodded. "Braden's strength is perfection. Every note is precise, every rhythm exact. But music isn't just about being perfect. It's about telling a story. That's your strength. Landon thought about that. Could his playing really compete with someone like Braden just by being different? Mrs. Davenport pulled up a chair. Show me what you've got, Landon. Let's make sure your music doesn't just sound good, it feels good. Landon took a deep breath, placed his fingers on the keys, and started again. Landon's fingers hovered over the keys as he prepared to play again. Mrs. Davenport leaned forward, watching him closely. Tyler sat nearby, arms crossed, waiting to see what she would say. This time, Landon played with purpose. The familiar melody of his grandfather's song filled the room, slow and steady. But as he played, something felt off. He was focused on getting every note right, just like Braden would. And somehow, that made it feel less like his music. Mrs. Davenport let him finish before nodding slowly. Technically, that was fine, she said. But it didn't feel like the same song you played yesterday. Landon frowned. I was trying to make it perfect. There's your mistake. She stood and walked over to the piano. Braden plays with precision. That's his strength. But when you played for the class, you weren't thinking about being perfect, you were telling a story. And that's what caught everyone's attention. Landon looked down at the keys. So. I just play how I feel. Exactly. Tyler clapped his hands together. Okay, so we're saying Landon's got the heart and Braden's got the technique. But how does that help him win? Mrs. Davenport smiled. Because music isn't just about hitting the right notes. It's about making people feel something. And if Landon can do that in the competition, he has a real shot. Landon thought about that. He had spent so much time worrying about competing with Braden's skill that he hadn't considered what made his music special in the first place. His grandfather never played to impress people, he played because music told a story. It carried emotions, memories, and feelings that words couldn't always capture. Landon straightened in his seat. Okay. Let's try this again. This time, he didn't focus on playing it perfectly. He let the music flow naturally, adding little flourishes the way his grandfather used to, playing from instinct instead of fear. The room seemed to shift, the notes sinking deeper, wrapping around them like a warm breeze. When he finished, there was a pause. Then Mrs. Davenport smiled. Now that sounded like Landon Hayes. Tyler grinned. Bro, you got this. Landon exhaled. Maybe he really did. The day of the competition arrived faster than Landon expected. The auditorium at Crestwood Academy was bigger than he imagined, with rows of chairs stretching out in every direction. The stage lights shone brightly, making the polished grand piano in the center of the stage gleam under the spotlight. Landon stood near the side of the stage, his fingers twitching as he listened to the contestants ahead of him. Each performance was flawless, sharp, precise, and technically perfect. He could hear the murmurs in the audience, the quiet gasps when someone played an especially difficult piece. Braden was standing a few feet away, his arms crossed. He looked completely relaxed, as if this was just another practice session. When his name was called, he walked to the piano with confidence. The room fell silent as he placed his hands on the keys. And then, he played. Landon couldn't deny it, Braden was incredible. His fingers moved effortlessly across the keys, his expression calm and focused. The piece was complex, fast, and beautifully executed. It was the kind of performance that made judges nod in approval. When Braden finished, the audience clapped politely, some even whispering to each other about how talented he was. He stood, gave a small nod, and walked off the stage. As he passed Landon, he smirked. Good luck topping that. Landon swallowed hard. His stomach twisted as the announcer called his name. This was it. He stepped onto the stage, feeling every eye in the room on him. Sitting at the piano, he took a deep breath, pressing his hands against the cool keys. The auditorium was silent, waiting. Landon closed his eyes. He wasn't going to compete with Braden's skill. He was going to play the way his grandfather taught him. Then, he began. The first notes were soft, carrying a gentle rhythm that rolled through the room like waves. It wasn't a show-off piece, it was a story, one that spoke in melodies instead of words. As he played, the audience grew quieter, leaning in. Landon felt something shift in the air. He wasn't playing to prove anything. He was playing because this was his music, his sound. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid. Landon's fingers danced across the keys, his music filling the auditorium with a warmth that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the kind of performance meant to impress, it was the kind meant to move people. Each note carried the heart of every lesson his grandfather had ever taught him. Every chord told a story, one of resilience, passion, and something deeper, something real. The room was silent, not out of boredom, but because they were listening. Even Braden, who had been so sure of his own victory, had stopped smirking. His arms were no longer crossed, his fingers tapped lightly against his sleeve, like he was feeling the music too. The final note lingered in the air, drifting through the stillness. For a moment, nothing happened. Landon sat at the piano, breathing deeply, his fingers resting gently on the keys. Then, slowly, someone in the audience clapped. Another followed. And then another. The quiet applause built into something stronger, something undeniable. The audience wasn't just clapping. They were cheering. Landon stood, his heart pounding, not with nerves, but with something else. He turned to face the judges, who exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Braden was staring at him, but the look in his eyes had changed. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was something closer to respect. The head judge stood. "Landon Matthews," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "That was remarkable." Landon blinked. His throat felt tight. "Thank you," he managed. When the winners were announced, Landon didn't need to hear his name to know he had won. Sure, there was a trophy, and yes, the title was his, but that wasn't the real victory. The real victory was the way the audience had listened. The way their expressions had softened, their hearts opened. The way Braden had finally seen him, not as a nobody, but as someone worth remembering. As Landon stepped off the stage, students and strangers alike came up to him, congratulating him, asking about his music. Even Braden, after a long pause, muttered, "That was good." Landon grinned. "I know. Because now, no one could ignore him. Not after this. Not after they had heard him.